Welcome back to this 10-part series on racism and structural racism in the United States. We've talked in earlier episodes in the series about how every aspect of American society was infected with racist ideas from the time of its foundation up until the present day. And we've also talked about how these racist ideas were institutionalized into the government, that it was structured into the political system, it was structured even into the religious institutions to justify the exploitation of black people in these United States. And so I want to continue that discussion by talking about a period of time that many historians feel may have been the only time in U.S. history where anti black racism was not a part of the structured way and the relationship that the government and the press, well, not so much the press, excluding the press, but the government, the schools, the educational institutions, and others were not anti-black in its practices. And I'm talking about the period of Reconstruction, a very interesting period of American history that lasted perhaps 12 years. I would say from 1866 till about 1877. This is a period immediately after the South conceded defeat in the Civil War, and the federal government sent Union troops, sent American troops into the South to enforce the mandate coming from the president and from the legislation, constitutional amendments, to legislate and mandate that people of African descent will not be re-enslaved in this country, and that people of African descent, males, would be able to vote in elections. Now, this voting on the part of African American males was the first time that this applied to African American males living anywhere in the United States. For racist whites and for whites that were very dubious about the potential of former enslaved people to make intelligent decisions about in elections, about candidates, this was a very frightening thought that now these formerly enslaved people will now be able to vote. And what was the consequence of this? The consequence of voting, particularly in the South, was the election of African American senators, African Americans as leaders of the House of Representatives. There were a few African American mayors in numerous elected positions throughout the South. As a matter of fact, in the state of Mississippi, during the Reconstruction period, there were two African American senators from the state of Mississippi, perhaps one of the most racist states at that time, and many say up until today, one of the most racist states in the country. And so during this period of Reconstruction, the African American people began to experience, as just communities where they were living, these freedmen were experiencing occasional terrorism, domestic terrorism by white folks. What the Ku Klux Klan was established in Pulaski, Tennessee in 1865 at the conclusion of the Civil War. And one of the charges, one of the objectives and goals of the Ku Klux Klan was to terrorize black people into returning to their subservient role that had been imposed on them for the entire time that we had been in this country up until the ending, the official ending of enslavement in this nation. And so the Klan rapidly spread across the South. And what we find during the spread of the Ku Klux Klan is that they were nothing short of a domestic terrorist group between the years of, um, and I would dare say, and this is after Reconstruction, maybe around 1889, 1888 to 1889, until the late 1920s or the early 1930s. On average, 4 black people were lynched in the United States every 4 days in the United States during this particular period. Many of these lynchings were organized by and inspired by the domestic terrorist acts of the Ku Klux Klan. So even though for the first time in the history of the nation that a true civil democracy, a democracy that was based not on racial citizenship, but a democracy based on those who lived in the country and had been in the country for a certain period of time, during this Reconstruction period, this is the first time in the history of the United States up until that point that this nation was showing potential to actually provide liberty and justice for all of its citizens. But this liberty and justice for black people was interrupted by anti-black terrorist acts, and it was interrupted by Andrew Johnson pulling federal troops out of the South. So now the Southern planters and those Southern white elected officials felt that now was the time to put African Americans back into their place, to institute systems and laws that would make sure that the mentality of black people would not be that they're equal to whites, to make sure that they would not be able to rise to certain social or socioeconomic levels in the United States. So from the time of the late 1800s until around 1930, 4,700 to 5,000 black people were lynched in the United States as a result of domestic terrorism. And these lynchings were treated as if they were collective multifamily picnics, in that postcards were made up about the lynchings of black people in this country and passed around and distributed like they were birthday cards or Christmas cards or something. That oftentimes African American people were not only lynched, but then they were thrown into fires and burnt. And you find children, white women, white men standing around these burning bodies and captured in photographs as if they were at some public entertainment. People were smiling and laughing and posing with these pictures. So these acts of domestic terrorism against black people were attempts to physically and mentally and emotionally return African American people to the status that we had been in prior to emancipation, the physical emancipation in 1865. All during this period, in the courts of this country, in the law enforcement of this country, everything was based on racism and based on structural racism. And I just want to add, because I had failed to mention the development of police departments, because this is how we started this series, talking about how many African American men, women, and children had been killed extrajudicial killings by police and white vigilantes. In 1704, slave patrols were actually organized in the state of South Carolina, perhaps for the first time. These slave patrols became the model by which Southern police departments would be based on. The slave patrols were organized not only to keep uh, people of African descent, black people, in their so called place, but also, if there were runaways from plantations, to return them to the plantations. They were an attempt to keep the white privilege in the area of, um, of economic supremacy that white people had over the enslaved population. And so, after the period of enslavement, police departments assume a very similar role in policing African American communities and keeping these communities in their place.